Welcome back, friends, colleagues, and potential disciples in a biomechanics cult. Well, we managed to get through the boring stuff in the first episode with the PowerPoint presentation, but let's fire up the light board this time and we'll start to apply what we've learned to a human lever. Recap from where we left off. We looked at the example of the barbell, which is a really good representation of a third-class lever system. Third class because it has the rotation point down one end. It has the resistance down the other, and in between the two, it has the effort, which when we're looking at a barbell, the effort is always going to be you, the person lifting the barbell. Now, we determined that this is a terrible, terrible lever system for strength. But the key takeaway was, the further we went in this direction, the harder it was to rotate this barbell, to get it to move around its point of rotation. The closer we went to that end, towards the resistance, the easier it got. And in fact, if we were to grab it from the other end, past the resistance, what happens? Well, we change the type of lever. We change that from a third class lever, and this then becomes a second class. Because now, the resistance is the thing that's in between the fulcrum and the effort of you, the effort of muscle. Now, I love that example because it's representative of the types of lever systems that we have in our body. Our body is predominantly made up of third-class levers. And so this really becomes one of the biggest considerations as a coach or just anyone who's training someone else, is that to become really strong, we have to overcome the fact that we have all of these third-class levers in the body, which are built to amplify speed, built for velocity, not built for strength. Doesn't mean we can't get strong, but we get strong in spite of having these levers, not because of them. All right, so let's take our example from before and let's make it a little bit harder. Now, just to recap again, with the barbell was laying parallel to the ground, which means that the force of gravity was acting exactly perpendicular to the ground, which it always does, never changes. But your force of muscle was also acting completely perpendicular to the ground. That means that the moment arm for resistance and the moment arm of force were identical to the point along the lever where those forces were being exerted, the force of gravity and the force of muscle. I know that might sound a little bit confusing at first, but it will make sense in a second. Now, before I draw this lever problem, let's look at what happens to this barbell if I just slightly rotate it. So now it's up like that. Here's my point of rotation. This is still my plate. Gravity's still going down through the plate. And you, as the person lifting it, you're still pulling upwards. But whereas before the barbell was out to here, now that you're rotating it, this distance is changing. So now there is a new arm created. And this is specifically what we call the moment arm. Now, the moment arm is quite simply the distance between fulcrum and force vector at a right angle. Okay, this is the most important part. So as we start to rotate this barbell, force of gravity is still going straight down, but you can see that it's shifted over this way because the barbell itself is rotating up. As we rotate it, the location of the barbell and the weight going down shifts over this way. That means now that the distance between our gravity vector, which is shifted from over here, where it was before, now it's over here. means that the distance between the fulcrum at a right angle to gravity has now changed. Now we have it over here. And that's our right angle right there. So before we even discuss this in the human body, what do you think is happening here when we've decreased this moment arm for the resistance? Well, we're now exerting the same amount of force over a smaller moment arm, meaning that our torque is less. So the higher up this barbell goes, the less torque it generates. Now that doesn't mean this is still going to be terribly easy, but if this was most of the way up and you grabbed hold of it there, you could probably hold it much, much easier. Now let's apply all of this to the human body. Okay, upper arm, forearm. We'll call this lever the ulnar. So here's the lever that we're going to work with. I'm going to just add brachialis and biceps brachii together into one imaginary elbow flexor, which is going to insert like this. So this is its force vector. It's pulling in that direction as it tries to rotate or hold in equilibrium this lever. How much force does that muscle generate? We don't know. Maybe we can figure that out. But to the eagle-eyed observer, you will notice something already happening. This ulnar, this lever, is basically our barbell that we were talking about before. The same concept applies. Here is your point of rotation. This is the fulcrum. Here is your resistance. And this time it's coming in the form of a dumbbell that weighs 10 kilograms. And here is your effort. Your muscle is inserting just past the fulcrum. This is the muscle that's responsible for either lifting this weight, holding it in place, or actively lowering this weight. And that force of muscle is in between the fulcrum and the resistance, meaning that this is definitely a third class lever. Great. So we know off the bat it's terrible. Without even looking at anything else, we know that this muscle is going to have to generate significantly more force than is being imposed upon the lever by the resistance, by the dumbbell, in order to hold this all in equilibrium. As in like an isometric contraction, there's neither shortening nor lengthening occurring. And so before in the previous example where we were talking about the barbell, it was just a matter of figuring out what these distances were. So I'm going to give this a distance of resistance arm is going to be 0.31 meters. And I'm going to say that the muscle effort arm is going to be 0.03 meters. And we did the calculation before. We'll take this 10 kilos and we'll make it 98.1 newtons when we expose it to the force of gravity. And so the calculation then became pretty easy. To figure out our torque over resistance, we just multiplied our force by our distance. We got our torque. And then to figure out our force of effort of our muscle, all we had to do was divide our torque that we generated by the distance of that muscle arm. But that was when we were dealing with something that looked like this, where the barbell was parallel to the ground and our forces were perpendicular. Because like I said before, in this instance, the resistance effort arm was the same thing as the resistance moment arm. They were basically the same thing. Right, so if we want to apply the same technique that we used before to this example and we figure out how much muscle is required to overcome this 98.1 newtons, we need a moment arm. That's the only thing that will allow us to solve this problem. Now, I said before that the moment arm was the distance between the point of rotation and the force vector. We only have one force so far. We're trying to solve another force and we only have one, which means that we have to tackle this force first. What is the force vector for the weight? Gravity. So, gravity always acts straight down. That never changes. Okay, so we have our force of gravity acting downwards. And we know that a moment arm intersects our force vector at a right angle to the fulcrum. So this is our moment arm right here. We've made a right angle intersecting the force vector with our fulcrum. Now this should look pretty familiar to most people. What have we drawn here? We've drawn a right angle triangle. Okay, let's label it. So on this side of the triangle, we have a value. That value is 0.31 meters. So what we have here is the hypotenuse. We need an angle for this to work. So I'm going to say that this entire elbow angle is equal to, what would we say, 135 degrees. Okay. We know that this entire right angle triangle equals up to 180 degrees. We have 90 there, so these two should also add up to 90. Clearly 135 can't be the angle of this triangle. So how do we figure this out? The entire elbow angle is 135 degrees from there to there. Well, we have another right angle right here. So we know that this right angle is 90 degrees. So to figure out this angle, it's just a matter of 135 degrees minus 90 is going to leave us with 45 degrees in here. So I know that this angle is 45 degrees. Okay, now I have everything that I need. But before we can do our trigonometry, we need to figure out what trigonometry function we're going to use. So we have sine, we have cosine, we have tangential. So we're not going to worry about tangential for these examples. We're going to stick with sine and cos. Now sine, we're looking at opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine, we're looking at adjacent over hypotenuse. Well, what is this distance? Which side of the triangle is that one? If this is the hypotenuse, the angle across, the side across from the angle is your opposite. So this has to be your adjacent. And if we think about this, it should make perfect sense what we're trying to figure out here. We want to know the distance of the moment arm. The only other distance we have here to work with is on the hypotenuse. So what we're trying to figure out is, what is the moment arm? What is this adjacent side of the triangle in relationship to the hypotenuse? So as a factor of, or a function of. All right, let's do some math. So 45 cosine gives us 0.707. So 0.707 multiplied by our distance of our resistance arm gives us a moment arm distance for resistance of 0.219 meters. So you can look at that straight away and just visually confirm to yourself that that is the correct answer. Because what are we saying here? We're saying that our adjacent line should be slightly smaller than our hypotenuse. We can tell that just by looking at it. We can see here that this answer, 0.219, is just slightly smaller than our resistance arm of 0.31. So that checks out. That makes a lot of sense. If you got something that was 2 meters up here or 0.002 meters, something's gone wrong. You need to redo that calculation. Okay, so what can we do now? We have the things that we need to figure out our torque of resistance. So torque of resistance then just becomes torque of resistance equals force times distance of the moment arm, or 98.1 multiplied by 0.219 meters. So torque of resistance is equal to negative 21.5 Newton meters. Easy. Okay. So why did I put negative 21.5 Newton meters? Okay, well, this is a clockwise torque. In biomechanics, when we look at clockwise torques, we label them as negative. Counterclockwise torques are positive. Okay, so I've redrawn this now and I've zoomed in so we can figure out the muscle side of the equation. So again, remember, keep your eye on the prize all the time. We're trying to solve force of muscle to keep this whole system in equilibrium. Now, we finished off the last part and we had a torque of resistance of negative 21.5 Newton meters. All right, so if this is starting to become confusing already, just take your mind back to the barbell that we spoke about before. And to figure out what force was required by your effort, your muscle effort, it was just a matter of taking the torque that we generated over here for resistance and dividing it by this distance of the muscle arm. And that gave you force of muscle. Okay, no different this time. The only difference being we have to now add in this extra step of figuring out what is the moment arm of this muscle. Okay, let's add in what we know. We know that this distance here is, what did I say? 0.03 meters. And we're going to give the muscle an insertion angle of 50 degrees. All right, so what was the definition of a moment arm? It is the distance between the force vector and the fulcrum at a right angle. So let's carry that across. Let's make a right angle here, carry that across to the force vector. Okay, now we have our triangle. We'll apply the same theory that we did before. This is our hypotenuse. This is our value of distance that we're using to solve this distance. So hypotenuse there. This is our angle. So this side is opposite. It's opposite the angle, which means that this is the adjacent. Now, the distance that we're trying to solve is this line here. So instead of being a cosine function like it was before, now we're doing a sine function. We're trying to find the opposite over the hypotenuse using this value here to solve that value there. Okay, so this should be a relatively easy equation. So we're going to do sine of 50, which I think is just 50, but let's have a look. Nope, totally wrong. Sine of 50 is equal to 0.766. All right, so the same as we did last time, we now take 0.766 multiplied by 0.03, and we have our distance of the moment arm for muscle as 0.022 meters. Okay, so now we have everything that we need to solve this. Let's get rid of this. We'll take our numbers with us. Okay, so these are the magic numbers that we need to figure this out. Now, you might be asking yourself, why are we dividing the muscle, the moment arm of the muscle, by the torque of resistance? So let's remember, what unit is torque expressed as? So torque is equal to force times distance. Force is newtons, distance is meters. So torque is expressed in Newton meters. How do we arrive at Newton meters? Well, we multiplied something by something. We multiplied newtons by distance in meters, which gave us this value here. So what do you think is going to happen if I take a different distance? So 0.22 meters is different to the distance that was used to calculate this torque of resistance. If I take this new distance that I've generated, which is, let's keep our eye on the prize here, equivalent to this distance where you were standing here trying to pick this barbell up and you had to exert a significant amount of force, like 200 kilos force to lift this barbell up. This is saying that if you now divide this torque by 21.5 by this much smaller moment arm, this moment arm here versus the much larger moment arm for the resistance, you're going to wind up with a Newton value. When you take Newton meters and divide it by meters, you are left with newtons. That's the only thing that remains in that equation once you extract meters back out of it. So, force of muscle is equal to torque of resistance divided by distance of the moment arm for the muscle force. Or all right, let's solve it. Okay, so force of muscle is equal to 21.5 divided by 0.022 meters gives us 977.27 newtons. Okay, so let's look at what we've got here. In order to hold that 10 kilo dumbbell at the end of the lever on the ulna and keep it in position, that elbow flexor had to generate 977.27 newtons of force. So almost 10 times the amount of force as the dumbbell itself. Well, I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. That's just the beginning. There's going to be plenty more where that came from. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you back here on Biomechanic.